Hi, welcome to the bathtub. This is Scott Bradfield, the master bather. This is the post-influenza edition of the bathtub. I've had the flu for about 10 days and I've just been sick. And I'll be coughing in your face, so don't get too close to the screen because I'll be coughing at you. So I want to talk a couple things. The picture, the wonderful picture by up there for the International Bathing Association from our friend BK Smith is up on our website, on our YouTube channel, and basically it reminds me to tell you that we have a 2-for-1 free membership, lifetime membership, International Bathing Association. It entitles you to read books in any bathtub in the known universe. We don't cover the unknown universe. We cover the known universe. And you can read a book any of those bathtubs, and you don't have to ask anybody, and you don't have to write a paper for anybody after you've finished your bath. So that's one of our things that's important. We put you on the map, and all you have to do is write me on any one of my talks and say, "Tub me up, Master Bather. I'm X, and I live in Long Island or somewhere else horrible, like I don't know." Milpitas or somewhere like that, and this is where I live. And if you want to sign up your bathing buddy, last week I signed up. My bathing buddy is now Boris Johnson, and you can sign up a bathing buddy, and we'll put him or her on the map as well. It's free, it's fun, it's free. Those are the important things. The second thing is I've got a few people have been writing me with concerns that that every time I say the term master bather, they think that maybe there's something unsavory about calling myself a master bather, and they're afraid of being referred to as master bathers as well. So I don't know why, and I haven't quite figured that out. But I will say this: that when you're in your bathtub, or when you're in here listening to your YouTube videos, me talking to you about books that you should read, and if your wife or husband or partner or somebody is in the other room and they start asking what you're doing, what you should say to them is, "Honey, I'm master bathing with the master bather, and the master bather thinks that if I master bathe enough, I could become a master bather myself." It's not a tongue twister. It's simply a statement of fact. All of you can become master bathers. You just have to watch enough of these videos and take enough baths. Okay? Today's talk is going to be, again, it's one of those, if you like so-and-so, you might like so-and-so talks. I spent a lot of time putting these things together, and these great concepts. I spent forever in the bathtub. This one is called If You Like J.G. Ballard, and I like J.G. Ballard in the bathtub, then you might very well like Michael Blumlein, and that's somebody who you may not know. So it's kind of a specious comparison because they're very different writers, but it's a way of talking about Michael Blumlein. I'm a big fan. I won't talk much about Ballard. We will read Ballard in the bathtub eventually. I love his stuff, and every once in a while I go through reading jags of his stuff. Some of the earliest books I've read were some of these old paperbacks. Voices of Time, one of my all-time favorite science fiction collections, with these great covers and these great opening sentences. Ballard has the greatest opening sentences. Later, Power is often thought of Whitby and the strange grooves the biologist had cut, apparently at random, all over the floor of the empty swimming pool. You don't know what the hell's going on, but you really get involved right in these weird stories, and he's obsessed about some of his images. He's famous for this book called Crash. I like a lot of it. Actually, Crash is a pretty good one. And it kind of put me off for a long time. But when we talk about Crash eventually, and we'll have to reread it to talk about, one of the things I did notice is it's kind of super serious. It's about sex and car crashes and stuff. And it's got lots of philosophical, cultural criticism and so forth. But one of the things I noticed when I read Crash is that I had not noticed it until I read Crash. But Ballard's actually really a funny writer. And I never thought of him as a funny writer before. And his later books I quite like. Cocaine Nights, which is kind of a comedy about the middle class, the British middle class. He starts spending his last 5-10 books doing these very, very funny. High Rise was made into a kind of boring movie recently, and that's a good example. These people living in these middle class enclaves away from the rest of the world, and they get better after High Rise, actually. This is one of my favorite Millennium People. It's when the middle class of Britain feel like they're totally the ones getting screwed, and they go around causing having terrorist attacks on all the middle class institutions like the British Film Institute and I can't remember the BBC and stuff like that. It's a pretty funny book, and everyone takes it very seriously in the book. But you can tell Ballard's having a good time. Okay, so very briefly, we're gonna do Ballard more properly soon. You don't probably know Blumlein, and the reason I decided to talk about Blumlein today is he just died. It was terrible, sad. I did not know Blumlein personally. He and I both 30 years ago used to publish in a little magazine called Interzone. And he and I exchanged a few postcards saying we liked something of each other's and so forth. And I really liked his work. And I can't say I kept up with it as much as I wish I had. There's so many good writers. But I want to talk a little bit about some of his work. He's pretty well known. This was an early book of his in the 80s called The Brains of Rats. It includes some of those early Interzone stories. And it was published by Scream Press. It's probably easy to get a cheap edition of this. It's his first collection of stories. It's his most Ballard-like collection of stories, and possibly because of the story that kind of put him on the map and kind of as a writing kind of controversial stories, which is called Tissue Ablation and Variant Regeneration, a Case Report. And I read this in Interzone, and it's a disturbing story. I'll give you the opening sentence. At 7 a.m. on Thursday morning, Mr. Reagan was wheeled through the swinging doors and down the corridor to operating room 6. He was lying flat on the gurney, and his gaze was fixed on the ceiling. He had the glassy stare of a man in shock. The story is told from the viewpoint of a doctor, and I didn't reread this recently. I find that story quite disturbing. And it's basically describing a doctor who takes Reagan, who basically came into American. He started doing stuff that Trump had just, is now just rampantly running around doing, and just treated the people who had the least the worst. And it's a kind of a weird revenge fantasy in which this doctor gets Reagan into an operating room, and they have a way of somehow harvesting his organs and using them, as I recall, to feed or benefit the poor. And it's about this kind of physical torment of this man, this horrible man. Reagan was a horrible man. This physical, which in a fictional way, and at the same time, the sense that they're trying to do something good out of it. And it's a weird, disturbing story. Blumlein wrote he was a doctor, he was a medical doctor, treated patients regularly. I guess he taught medicine. I don't know much about him, but he writes with a clinical detachment, particularly about physical bodies and about sex. And another story that's quite disturbing is The Brains of Rats, which is again, I recall, because I didn't reread those two stories, is a doctor's observations of sexual abnormalities and these contemplations of the differences between men and women in terms of sex. Now, those are the most peculiar and Ballardian type stories. They'll remind you a little bit of those, Hugh Coma, Marilyn Monroe, the stories of Ballard when he was doing those experimental novels, short novels, with John F. Kennedy and so forth. These little 5, 6-page stories with celebrities in them. I think they're much more interesting. I like Ballard's work. I'm not wild about his atrocity exhibition as much, but these were much more disturbing and much more pointed political stories, from what I could tell, and philosophical stories. He goes on and writes a number of different stories in this book. It's not my favorite Blumlein book, but it's an interesting book to read, and it shows the range of his work. It has a story in there called Bestseller. I won't tell you much about it, but it's one of the best stories. A long story, and it's kind of more representative of what Blumlein goes on to do. And it's about a writer who's trying to write bestsellers, and he finds that the only way he can make a living is by selling his body parts to a wealthy, super wealthy person. That story was written in the mid-'80s, and we live in a world now with these ridiculous disproportions of wealth where we may be selling ourselves to people, maybe even now, these super, super wealthy creeps. Okay, so that's a good picture of this book. It's very worth knowing and reading. I haven't got it yet, but he also published a lot of stories in fantasy and science fiction. another magazine about the same time I was publishing there. And I used to read his stories in there, and they're really good. He just continues writing really interesting, unusual stories, usually with a science fiction or fantasy element. The science that he knows is medicine and bodies. And again, that dispassionate, critical look at human bodies is creepy, but there's a really human, likable person behind it. Just like in Ballard. Ballard is actually, there's a cold, clinical, kind of horrific surface to his work, but behind it there is quite a compassionate and compassionate intelligence behind it. So I would recommend that. What I would much more recommend, I think you should know his stories, but perhaps get, there's another collection which we will talk about maybe in a month or two, which I've ordered, which includes all of Blumlein's late stories as well. I read this when it came out. It's called The Movement of Mountains. I'm going to have a sip of my my Raymond Chandler cocktail glass Manhattan. Exact same cocktail glass that Humphrey Bogart uses in The Big Sleep. The Movement of Mountains is a science fiction book in the mid-'80s. It's kind of been forgotten, and it really should not be. I'm rereading it now. I actually wasn't going to reread it. I picked it up this morning. I was just going to start it, see what, remind myself of the book, and I really can't put it down. I enjoyed it the first time, just a great deal as well. And it's much more of a traditional, quote unquote, traditional science fiction story. But Blumlein doesn't write science fiction like a lot of people. He knows the body, he knows medicine, and it deals with the idea of a kind of an AIDS-like virus, but it takes place in this future Earth where people can bioengineer themselves, and they can bioengineer human beings so that they can do slave labor on foreign mining colonies for these big giant corporate monsters. It's a pretty dark version of the corporate world as seen by Blumlein in the 80s, and he pretty much maps our trajectory because we're really on that trajectory that he starts to describe in the 80s. And it's told in his style is quite direct, clinical, like he's saying clinical in a way, but he's got a real human compassion for his characters, but he has no romanticism in it. And he's interested in sexuality. He's interested in how the body affects the people that live in them. At one point he says, I'm not worried about the drugs that sell on the street. I'm worried about the drugs our bodies manufacture for us. That's one of my favorite lines in the book. It's an interesting love story where he goes off to this foreign, the doctor goes off to this foreign colony to deal with these things called the domers, or these giant, basically giant walls of fat who are designed to mine a certain drug on this foreign planet. And it's not filled with monsters. It's not filled with alien adventure stories or anything like that. It's very speculative, very philosophical. It's really hard to put down. He really knows how to tell a narrative about ideas. So you're really with this guy, and I'm about halfway through it again, and I'm really enjoying it. I forget where it goes. I really recommend this book, The Movement of Mountains. We're going to read some more Blumlein as we go along because I feel so sorry I'm so sad to hear that he died, and I had read his stories, and I kind of lost track of some of the novels. I'll be honest with you, I found him a little disturbing. Of all the writers we've talked about who are disturbing, he reminds me a little of Brian Evenson, a little bit of Ballard, but he is his eye on human life is so kind of detached from any romantic ideology or bullshit, and yet he still loves to tell a story. And he still likes his characters. So don't be put off too much by those particularly weird stories. And really try this. If you really want to try something very different in terms of, it's science fiction-y, but it's basically a philosophical, medical adventure, if that makes sense. All right. Anyway, and particularly if you do like Ballard or Evenson, Brian Evenson is another person to think of in context of Blumlein, definitely check this book out. Okay, and check out Brides of Rats, and we'll talk about the collected stories of Blumlein, hopefully in the next month or two, once I get my copy. Happy bathing, master bathe with the master bather. Just tell your partner that's what you're doing, and then if they look at you funny, you just walk away. Don't let them bother you because they're just jealous. That's all it is. All right, happy bathing. Bye.